She stood at the back of the churchyard, watching strangers celebrate a life she'd helped build. The wind carried the echo of vows she was never meant to hear, and in that moment Helena understood. Some truths arrive not in words, but in the silence where your name should have been. Helena, a 70-year-old stepmother from a quiet American town, had spent years supporting her late husband's only son. Rent, groceries, and even small indulgences, all given without expectation. Their relationship had always been uneven but peaceful, held together by her loyalty to the man she married. But when the boy grew older and prepared for marriage, a shift settled over him, subtle at first and then unmistakable. Helena kept giving, believing kindness would return in its own time. She never imagined the wedding would become the moment that revealed everything she had tried not to see. The sun had barely crested the roofs when Mrs. Alden stopped by my fence, her arms full of laundry and gossip. I remember the way the morning light clung to her hair, making her words seem lighter than they were. "They're having the ceremony next month," she said as if she were mentioning the weather. "Such a sweet couple." I nodded, though I wasn't sure who she meant at first. And then I felt it, like a small, sharp thread pulling somewhere deep inside me. Because the boy she was talking about was mine to raise, but apparently not mine to be told about. I stayed by the fence long after she'd gone, my hands still resting on the cool wood. The yard felt different that morning. Quieter. As if something had been taken from it, though nothing had moved. I could hear the hum of cicadas warming in the trees, the low groan of a passing truck, and beneath it all, the faint trembling of my own breath. Inside, the house smelled of lemon soap and old pine. It always did. Routine had a way of holding things together even when the heart didn't know how. I hung my jacket, set the mail on the counter, and boiled water for tea I wasn't sure I wanted. I tried to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a different couple, or maybe someone had spoken too soon. But a small voice inside me, one that spoke softly but honestly, kept whispering otherwise. It wasn't the news itself that hurt. Weddings are meant to be joyful, and I had prayed for years that he would find someone to love. It was the way I learned about it. The way the information just slipped into the world without him thinking to hand it to me first. The kettle clicked off. I didn't drink the tea. I just stood there listening to the house breathe around me. Later that afternoon I found myself at the kitchen table, sorting through bills I'd already paid. I wasn't really looking at them. My hands moved because they needed something to do. Something steady, something familiar. The clock ticked above me, slow, determined, almost comforting. It reminded me of all the evenings I'd waited for him to come home when he was younger. How he would toss his backpack on the floor and ask what was for dinner. How he used to sit right where I sat now, his elbows on the table, telling me about school or friends or the world outside our small town. I reached into the drawer and took out my husband's ring. The gold had dulled over the years, but the inside was still smooth, still warm somehow. I turned it between my fingers, the metal clicking gently against the wood. I thought about the last time my boy, had come by. It had been brief. He stood in the doorway, shifting from foot to foot, as though he didn't want to cross into a life he'd already stepped away from. He mentioned work, bills, the usual burdens of someone too young to carry so much. But he didn't mention her. And he certainly didn't mention a wedding. As I held the ring, I tried to convince myself that he planned to tell me. That maybe he wanted to share the news in person properly like family does. But the doubt lingered, quiet and patient, just like the house. Evening came with long shadows across the floor, stretching toward me as though they were trying to say something I wasn't ready to hear. I lit the small lamp by the window, the one with the faded fabric shade. Its soft glow filled the room with a kind of tenderness I didn't feel. I sat down again, the ring still warm in my palm. I thought about my husband, how he used to say that love wasn't in the grand gestures but in the small ones. The quiet sacrifices. The things no one else noticed. I had tried to carry that truth forward after he passed. Tried to pour it into a boy who wasn't mine by blood, but mine in every other way that mattered. But as I sat there, the silence began to twist. It wasn't gentle anymore. It held weight. Questions. Truths I didn't want to look at directly. Why hadn't he told me? Why had the news reached the neighbor before it reached my door? Had he already decided where I fit in his new life, if anywhere at all? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they returned, steady as the ticking clock. I realized then that maybe it wasn't an oversight. Maybe it wasn't about forgetfulness or busy days or last-minute plans. Maybe it was intentional. And that thought sat with me as heavy as grief. By the time the sky turned a deep, quiet blue, I hadn't moved from the chair. The house had settled into its nighttime stillness, the kind that makes you aware of every creak, every breath, every unanswered question. I placed my husband's ring back in the drawer, gingerly, like returning something fragile to its resting place. Then I pressed my hand flat against the table and let the truth settle beside me. Someone had hidden joy from me. Someone I helped raise. Someone I had loved without keeping score. The room was dim, but I could see things more clearly than ever. And I couldn't help but wonder, if he kept this from me, what else had I already been left out of? The dress had been hanging in my closet for weeks, wrapped in soft cotton like something precious or fragile. Every time I opened the door to get my coat, the white fabric swayed ever so slightly as if exhaling. I used to feel proud when I saw it there. Proud that I could give them something beautiful, something new. But on the night I learned I wasn't invited to the wedding, the dress looked different. Like a guest that did not belong to me. Like a secret I had been keeping without knowing why. I didn't turn on any lights when I walked down the hallway. The dusk spilling through the windows was enough to guide me, painting the floors in long muted strokes. The house felt heavier that evening, as though it had been listening to my thoughts long before I spoke them aloud. I opened the closet door slowly. The hinges creaked. A soft, familiar sound that reminded me of the nights my husband used to come home late from work. I used to wait for that sound. It meant he was near. But now, the sound only revealed what I had tucked away in the quiet. The dress hung at the far end of the closet, the way something valuable is placed out of harm's reach. White lace, delicate sleeves, a neckline the bride had chosen after trying on at least 6 others. I remembered standing behind her in the shop, watching her study herself in the mirror. Her fingers trembled as she touched the beading. "This one," she whispered, almost too shy to claim it. And I had nodded, smiling because it felt good to give. It felt like being part of something. I told the clerk to wrap it carefully. I paid without looking at the total. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was a gift. A welcome into the family I had tried so hard to tend. Now looking at it, I wondered who the gift had truly been for. I stepped closer to the dress and ran my fingers along the protective cloth. It felt smooth, cool, like a memory I couldn't quite hold on to. I remembered the bride's smile when I handed her the garment bag that day. She held it like it might disappear. Her cheeks flushed pink. You really didn't have to," she said softly. "I wanted to," I told her. And I meant it. She didn't meet my eyes for more than a second. At the time I thought it was shyness. But now, with the neighbor's words still echoing, "only for special people," I wasn't sure. There had been a moment in the shop just before we left when she stepped away to take a phone call. It was brief, murmured words, a nervous laugh, a quick glance in my direction. When she came back, she seemed lighter. Too light, perhaps. I brushed the cloth again, remembering every small thing I had ignored. Every hesitation. Every incomplete sentence. She and the boy had always been polite, but politeness is a mask anyone can wear if they practice hard enough. For the first time, I wondered if the dress had been chosen because they knew I would offer to pay. If they had walked into that store with the plan already stitched quietly between them. The thought made my chest tighten, not in anger but in realization. I pulled the dress from the rack and laid it across the bed. The fabric unfurled slowly, like a curtain revealing something I'd been avoiding. Lace shimmered in the fading light, catching shadows that made it look older than it was. I sat beside it and waited for the feeling that usually came when I did something for someone I loved. A warmth, a soft pride, a sense of belonging. None of it came. Instead, I felt the weight of understanding settle over me. Not sudden like a strike, but gradual like snow gathering on a roof. I remembered the bride's eyes when she thanked me. She looked grateful, yes, but also relieved. The kind of relief that came when a plan fell neatly into place. Maybe she knew. Maybe she'd always known I wouldn't be included. The boy must have said something. Or maybe she'd seen enough in the way he spoke about me, distant, dutiful, careful, to understand her role in keeping things simple. I traced the lace with the back of my hand. It was beautiful. It truly was. The sort of dress a young woman would remember for the rest of her life. But it wasn't mine to keep. And it wasn't mine to celebrate. As the light disappeared completely from the room, I folded the dress back into its covering. My hands were steady, but something inside me wasn't. If they could hide this from me, What else had already been decided in rooms I would never be invited into? I returned the dress to the closet, easing the hanger back into place. The cloth swayed again, brushing against the coats and jackets that had belonged to my husband. For a moment I felt him there in the quiet, felt the echo of the home we had tried to build. I closed the door gently. Not out of anger but out of respect for the truth settling in my chest. The hallway seemed longer on my way back, as though the house itself had shifted. When I reached the kitchen, I turned off the light I hadn't realized was still on. In the dark I stood very still. And as the silence wrapped around me, a single thought rose to the surface. If the dress was only the beginning, what else had been planned without my knowing? The house had its own way of breathing. Slow, steady, familiar. But in the days before the wedding, its breath turned shallow. Floorboards that once creaked with warmth now sounded hollow. The air felt thick, as if it were holding back words no one wanted to say. Each morning I walked through the rooms, listening for something, anything, that might break the quiet. But all I heard was the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of a world that no longer seemed to need me. A house can feel abandoned even when you're still living in it. I boiled water out of habit, setting the kettle on the stove the same way I had for years. The flame flickered beneath it, a small blue tongue of heat licking the metal. I watched it until steam began to whisper from the spout. Then I poured it over the tea leaves and let the warmth rise into the room. But I didn't drink it. I just carried the cup from window to window, cradling it like something that needed comfort. Outside, the gravel road stretched long and empty. In other seasons, children rode their bikes along it or neighbors walked their dogs past my fence. But that week it seemed no one wanted to be seen. Or maybe I was the one who had gone invisible. I held the cup close to my chin, letting the steam touch my face. It was the only warmth I felt. The rest of the house sat in a kind of suspended stillness, like it was waiting for a truth it already knew. My eyes kept drifting to the phone on the counter. The screen stayed dark. No call. No message. Not even a mistake or a pocket dial. It wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the absence of intention. The kind that tells you, quietly and without ceremony, that you are no longer part of someone's story. The dog, my old faithful companion, followed me through the house. His nails clicked on the hardwood floor with every step, a gentle reminder that I wasn't completely alone. He watched me with eyes full of questions he couldn't ask. I knelt down and ran my hand along his neck. "You feel it too, don't you?" I whispered. His ears twitched. He pressed his head against my shoulder. Dogs know when something shifts. They smell it in the air long before we admit it. I walked into the living room, where sunlight slid through the blinds in thin, tired lines. The furniture looked untouched, as if waiting for a visit that wasn't coming. I folded a blanket on the arm of the couch even though it didn't need folding. I straightened picture frames that were already straight. Small motions. Small attempts to fill a silence that only grew heavier. I stopped by the doorway, listening again. The clock ticked. The fridge hummed. The house settled with a soft sigh. But beneath all that I heard something else. Something quieter, almost hidden. It was the absence of anticipation. For weeks I had told myself he might call. That he might knock on the door, clearing his throat, ready to explain. But the closer the wedding came, the more I could feel that hope slipping through my fingers like sand. As afternoon turned to early evening, the light began to fade. Shadows lengthened across the walls, stretching like long, tired arms. I set the untouched tea down on the counter, the cup still warm but the moment already cold. The phone sat beside it, silent and smug in its stillness. I reached for it once, twice, my hand pausing midair as though waiting for permission. Then I placed my fingers around it and held it up to my ear, listening to the emptiness before dialing anything at all. I didn't dial. The truth was, I didn't know what I would say. "Are you all right? Do you need anything? Did you forget to tell me, or did you choose not to?" Each question tasted like salt in my mouth. I set the phone back down and steadied myself against the edge of the counter. I felt the realization arrive. Not loudly, not painfully, but steadily, the way rain begins before you notice clouds. This silence wasn't accidental. It was crafted, curated, held in place by decisions made in rooms I was no longer welcome in. I looked around the house, all the little pieces of me tucked into corners, the memories on shelves, the echoes of life shared with people who had already moved on. And I wondered when it happened. When I stopped being part of the conversation. When my presence became optional. Night came quietly, slipping through the windows without ceremony. I sat on the edge of my bed, the dog curled at my feet, the house finally settling into its nighttime hush. The phone lay on the dresser, screen still dark. I didn't look at it anymore. I didn't need to. The silence had answered me more clearly than any voice could have. I reached back and turned off the lamp. The room softened into darkness, and for a moment, I listened to the slow, steady breathing of the dog beside me. And in that quiet, I asked myself a question I had never dared consider before. How long had I been living inside a silence I never agreed to? The morning light hadn't fully decided on its color yet. It hung over the church like a thin veil, pale and unsure, as if the sun itself wasn't certain it should be here. I sat in my car with the engine off, listening to the cold settle on the windshield. The glass fogged with every breath I took. From where I parked, half hidden behind unfamiliar cars, I could see the guests stepping out into the crisp air, their coats pulled tight, their voices soft as though they knew this wasn't my place. And maybe they were right. I don't remember deciding to come. I just remember the drive. The road stretched out like it was leading me somewhere I didn't belong, and still I followed it. The sky stayed the same washed-out shade of gray the whole way, a color that felt like waiting. The church appeared around a bend, white, modest, and older than any of us. Its wooden steps had been repainted not too long ago. They gleamed even under the dull morning. I parked farther away than I needed to, as if distance might soften the edges of what I was about to feel. The heater in the car had long gone cold, but I didn't turn it back on. Sometimes the chill steadies you. Sometimes it tells you the truth. I watched people I barely recognized walk toward the entrance. Some carried flowers. Some carried gifts. All of them carried an ease that felt foreign to me. They walked with the confidence of people who had been invited, people who belonged inside. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, fingers pressed tight. My breath kept catching in the little space between my ribs. I told myself I only came to see her arrive, only came to know she was safe, only came to make peace with something unnamed. But the truth was heavier than that, settling low and quiet in my chest. I came because I had nowhere else to put my hope. The church bells didn't ring. Maybe they never did. Maybe they were saving their voices for another day. Inside my car, everything sounded muffled. The footsteps outside, the way the wind brushed past, even my own heartbeat felt quieter than usual. Then I saw her. She stepped out of a small silver car, the kind you forget the shape of as soon as it drives away. Her dress wasn't the one hanging in my closet. This one was simpler, softer, a little too long at the hem. It brushed the gravel when she walked. Someone else held her bouquet. Someone else tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I leaned forward without meaning to, my fingers tapping the edge of the steering wheel in a small, nervous rhythm. She didn't look around as she made her way toward the church. It wasn't anger. It wasn't avoidance. It was something thinner, quieter, like she'd already let go of the part of her life that included me. When the doors opened, warm light spilled out, brushing her shoulders as she stepped inside. Then the doors closed again, cutting the warmth clean in half. I whispered a blessing she would never hear. Just a few soft words that floated into the cold air and dissolved before they reached anything that mattered. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. The stained glass windows shifted from blue to gold as the ceremony began. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the rhythm. I'd been to enough weddings to recognize the rise and fall of vows spoken with trembling hands. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the slow, uneven beat beneath my palm. It steadied me in a way words couldn't. I watched the windows glow brighter as if the whole room inside was exhaling at once. A shadow moved behind the glass. Maybe hers, maybe his. I couldn't tell. The shapes were blurred by the colors. But something in the movement felt final, like a door closing softly instead of being slammed. For a moment I wondered if she had looked for me. If maybe, just before speaking her vows, her eyes had flicked toward the back of the church, searching for a familiar face that wasn't there. The thought stung, but it was a gentle sting, the kind that comes from imagining something tender even if it isn't true. The first notes of music drifted faintly outside. A hymn. Slow, deliberate. The kind you feel more than you hear. Guests began to shift inside. Their silhouettes swayed like reeds in a shallow pond. The ceremony was ending. Life was moving forward with or without me. And for the first time that morning I let myself feel it. The morning. Not because she was gone. Not because I had been left behind. But because love, real love, has a way of making you grieve even the parts that were never yours. I sat back, letting the silence settle on my shoulders. It felt almost like a shawl, worn thin but still warm in places. When the doors finally opened, the guests spilled out laughing, adjusting their coats, brushing off the cold. I didn't wait to see her walk out. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed twice. I turned the key, letting the engine hum beneath me. As I pulled away, the church grew smaller in the rearview mirror, its stained glass glowing with colors I couldn't name. The road ahead was empty, stretching into a morning that still felt undecided. As I drove, I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand over my chest, steadying the quiet inside me. Love had happened. And somewhere in that pale, shivering light, I understood that letting go could be its own kind of ceremony. Laughter drifted across the churchyard like warm smoke, the kind that rises from a fire you're not invited to sit beside. It curled around the stone walls, slipped between the branches and settled on faces lit by the soft noon sun. I stood beneath the shadow of an old maple tree, its bark cool against my shoulder, and let the sound wash over me. Each laugh felt familiar yet far away, like a memory misremembered. People moved in gentle clusters, their bodies leaning toward warmth I could feel but couldn't enter. And still I stayed. Quiet. Unseen. Just breathing. The ceremony had ended, though I hadn't seen its final moment. I had only heard the soft swell of applause, muffled through the church doors, followed by the slow spill of guests into the yard. Their joy felt effortless, a kind of lightness that didn't belong to me. I stayed near the tree, half hidden, half exposed, the earth cold beneath my feet. The sky had cleared, leaving a pale blue that looked almost new. I watched strangers embrace each other as if they had known the couple their whole lives. Some wiped their eyes. Some checked their phones. Some adjusted their scarves as though the day itself might shift around them. They were comfortable here, comfortable with each other, comfortable with the moment. I envied the ease without meaning to. A woman with bright earrings laughed so loudly the sound startled a bird from a nearby branch. I followed her gaze to the center of the yard where people were gathering, forming a loose circle around the newlyweds. Cameras were raised, hands lifted, smiles arranged. It was a celebration suspended in time, simple, bright, untouched by any shadow. I pulled my coat tighter, not against the cold, but against the part of me that knew this wasn't my place. Till I stayed. As if staying might explain something. As if staying might soften whatever waited inside me. He appeared suddenly, stepping into the center of the circle with an ease that startled me. The boy, my boy, though he hadn't been mine for a long time. He looked taller somehow, or maybe it was the way he stood, shoulders relaxed, the angle of his jaw catching the sunlight in a way I'd never seen. He wasn't a child anymore. He hadn't been one for years. But seeing him now, surrounded by people who spoke his name with familiarity, felt like discovering a photograph you didn't remember taking. He laughed with them. Real full laugh. The kind that lifts at the corners and doesn't ask permission. A woman, his bride, touched his arm lightly as someone directed them into a pose. Her fingertips rested against the sleeve of his jacket, a gesture so small it felt enormous. He turned toward her with an ease that settled deep into my stomach. They posed together. Then with her parents. Then with his new in-laws. A few friends. More strangers. Each photograph captured a version of him I wasn't part of. I watched him lift a child into his arms for one picture, his smile wide, natural. The child reached for his face and he let them. He'd always been gentle like that. Soft where the world expected hardness. A group of guests called his name again, pulling him into another image that had no place for me. I felt something shift in my chest. Not break, not snap. Just shift, like a door I'd left cracked had finally swung open. Someone handed him a small bouquet and he held it carefully, his fingers adjusting the stems without looking down. The way he moved, steady, tender, reminded me of quieter years when I'd shown him how to hold fragile things. Back when he'd believed I knew everything. He didn't look toward the tree where I stood. He didn't scan the crowd. He didn't pause even for a heartbeat, as though some part of him sensed a familiar shadow nearby. He simply lived in the moment fully and freely as he should. But watching him, the man he'd become, pressed something sharp against the softest part of me. All those years of giving, of choosing him every day without question. Yet here he was, surrounded by people who'd known him only in seasons of ease. They belonged in these photographs in a way I never had. A guest tapped his shoulder, asking him to move closer to the center. He nodded, stepping into the frame with practiced comfort. I wondered then, quietly, almost painfully, if he would ever look back at these pictures and wonder about the edges. About the space just beyond the bright circle of celebration. About the figure who stood in the shadow of a maple tree, choosing to stay invisible so he could shine without interference. The thought held me still. Not hurting. Not healing. Just still. The laughter softened as the crowd shifted toward the reception hall. Voices thinned, fading into the distance like a tide pulling back to sea. He walked beside his bride, hand resting lightly at her back, guiding her through the doorway. I stayed beneath the tree until the yard grew quiet again, until even the birds seemed unsure whether to return. The light had tilted, turning the grass a muted gold. I stepped out from the shadows only when no one was left to see it. The empty yard felt larger than before, as if it had exhaled. For a moment I imagined one of those photographs. My place not in the center, not beside him, but just outside the frame. A presence felt only in absence. Then I turned away, letting the silence follow me into whatever would come next. The wind shifted just as I stepped past the church gate, carrying voices that didn't belong to me. Soft at first, like scraps of conversation brushed loose from a crowd. I wasn't trying to listen. I wasn't strong enough to. But certain words have a way of finding the person least prepared to hear them. A woman's voice drifted toward me, light, cheerful, unguarded. They kept it small, she said. Only for special people. The words slipped past my ribs as easily as breath. But once inside they hardened. Heavy. Cold. Unmistakable. I had been standing near the stone wall that bordered the churchyard, letting my fingers trace the old mortar. The sun had softened by then, turning the air a pale gold. Most of the guests lingered near the steps, talking in relaxed circles, hands wrapped around paper cups of coffee from the reception hall. I'd moved farther from the crowd, not for secrecy this time, but for space. Space to breathe. Space to feel whatever waited beneath the surface without giving it a name too soon. The ground beneath the wall was uneven, a mix of gravel and early spring mud. I could hear the click of cameras behind me, the rustle of dresses, the soft shuffle of people shifting into new conversations. A group of 3 stood just beyond the corner, 2 women and a man, their clothes pressed and bright. They looked like they belonged here, like they had always belonged. Their voices rose and fell in easy rhythm. I looked at the sky, pretending interest in a cloud drifting lazily overhead. Then came the sentence. Simple. Ordinary. But cut with intention I knew too well. They kept it small. Only for special people. Her tone held no malice. No awareness. She was simply sharing what she'd been told. My hand tightened unconsciously against the stone wall. The rough surface steadied me, kept my breath from stumbling out too loud. I tried to step away quietly, but grief has a sound, even when no one hears it. I drifted farther across the yard, letting their voices fade into soft static behind me. The grass was damp beneath my shoes, leaving dark marks that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. I kept my eyes on the ground, tracing the path of my own footsteps, as though they might explain something the world refused to. Another group walked past me, their laughter bright and oblivious. A man said, "It was perfect. Intimate. Exactly the right size." A woman responded, "They really thought it through. No extras. No obligations." I felt the words settle in the hollow beneath my collarbone. Quiet, deliberate, patient. I knew these phrases. I had heard them in other contexts. Other rooms. Other seasons of exclusion dressed up as preference. They didn't sting because they were cruel. They stung because they were true. I stopped near a patch of bare earth where a bench must have once stood. The ground held the shape of its absence. I knew that feeling too. I watched a pair of teenagers take photos near the church entrance, their faces flushed with excitement. It was the kind of joy that had nothing to do with me. Their world was easy because no one had asked them to earn a place in it. I wondered for a moment how long it had been since I'd felt that weightlessness. Behind me, another voice said, "It was nice not having too many people. Just the ones that matter. The ones that matter. The ones that matter." Each word peeled something inside me with surprising gentleness. I stepped behind the small shed where the maintenance tools were kept, letting the wooden structure shield me from the conversations drifting across the yard. The quiet felt like a thin blanket, barely warm but better than nothing. I leaned my back against the wall and let the truth settle. It hadn't been an oversight. It hadn't been forgetfulness. It had been a choice. Deliberate. Practiced. Comfortable. A choice made easily enough that no one felt the need to hide it. I thought of the years, decades really, spent stitching myself into the fabric of his life. Helping him through nights when he couldn't sleep. Staying awake beside him during storms he didn't know how to name. Paying for things quietly so he could feel the relief without the guilt. I had done it willingly. Lovingly. Without expecting applause. But never, not once, had I suspected that my presence could be so easily edited out. Somewhere across the yard someone called his name. The joy in their voice didn't falter. Why would it? The final thread inside me, thin, nearly invisible, gave way with a softness that surprised me. It didn't snap loudly. It released like a sigh. I lowered my head not out of shame but out of recognition. This was grief. Not for the dead. But for the living who had already walked away. When I finally stepped out from behind the shed, the yard looked different. Not empty, just changed. As though the world had shifted a few inches to the left, leaving me standing beside a life I no longer fit inside. A breeze lifted the edge of my coat, brushing against me like a question I couldn't answer. I watched the small clusters of guests move toward the reception hall, their steps unhurried, their voices light. No one looked in my direction. No one needed to. I took a slow breath, letting the cold settle into my chest without resistance. How do you grieve someone who is still alive? I didn't know. But as I walked toward the quiet road beyond the churchyard, I understood this much. I was already learning. The headlights barely reached the edges of the road, leaving the trees beyond in soft, blurred shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and early evening, and the sky above was a fading gray that whispered of night. I didn't turn on the radio. Silence felt honest. My hands rested on the wheel, loose but steady, as though the car itself might understand the weight I carried. The road stretched ahead, thin and unbroken, a ribbon that seemed to tie the past to whatever lay beyond the darkening horizon. And somewhere inside me, I realized that I had been holding on too long, gripping something fragile that wasn't mine to keep. The tires hummed against the asphalt, a steady rhythm that matched the slow pace of my thoughts. I remembered the mornings my late husband and I had shared on roads like this, windows down, coffee in hand, the world waking up in soft golden light. I could almost hear his voice, low and calm, reminding me that patience was a quiet kind of courage. I drove past familiar landmarks, an old barn with peeling paint, a mailbox leaning to one side, the river reflecting the dim light like a sheet of glass. Each one carried a memory, small and precise, like snapshots of a life I had loved and tried to protect. Somewhere between the bends, I realized that it wasn't just the wedding that had unsettled me. It was everything I had been carrying all these years. The rent, the groceries, the bills, the constant worry and care for a life that wasn't fully mine. I had believed responsibility was enough. But responsibility is silent. Responsibility doesn't ask questions, doesn't look back, doesn't pause. I swallowed and let my hand rest on the steering wheel. The silence inside the car was comforting and uncomfortable at once. I hadn't expected it to be this quiet, to feel this empty, yet somehow, free. The trees along the roadside blurred past like streaks of memory, their trunks dark and solid against the failing light. I didn't accelerate. I didn't slow down. I let the road dictate the pace, letting my thoughts drift into spaces I rarely visited. I thought of the boy I had raised, now a man with a bride who didn't know, or chose not to acknowledge, the years I had spent giving him more than he asked for. I thought of the quiet mornings, the late nights, the countless meals bought and cooked, the small comforts I had offered without expectation. And I realized with a gentle sharpness that it wasn't just love that I had carried. It was hope. Hope that he would see me. Hope that he would remember. Hope that my presence mattered. The thought made the steering wheel feel heavier beneath my hands. Not physically but emotionally. Hope can be light, almost invisible. But when held for decades, it becomes a weight pressing silently on the chest, demanding a recognition that may never come. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Shadows stretched along the road behind me, long and thin. They felt like reminders of everything I had done quietly, invisibly, without reward. And I wondered, how much longer can someone carry hope that never turns toward them? The horizon darkened, and the first stars appeared faintly, fragile and distant. I drove past the fields, past the houses that had once held laughter, past the places that had shaped me and held me in ways no one else could. I thought of my late husband again, of the vows we made in quiet ceremonies with no one to watch, no photographs to mark the moments. "I'll carry you," he had said once, a simple promise to stand with me through the years. I had taken that promise literally, carried him, carried the boy, carried hope, carried more than I even knew. Somewhere along this stretch, I realized that carrying hope had felt like responsibility. It had felt noble. But hope, when unacknowledged, has weight. It presses silently into your chest. It bends your back. It reminds you that life doesn't always return what you give. I pressed my hand lightly to the center of my chest, steadying my breath. I let the wheel rest between my hands. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the exhaustion of years, the quiet grief, the small ache of invisibility. The road didn't change. The trees didn't pause. But I did. And in that pause, I felt a strange, quiet relief. Like finally setting down a parcel you've been carrying too long, even if you don't yet know where it will fall. Night fully settled around me. The sky had turned a deep, gentle indigo. Only the faint glow of distant farmhouses punctuated the darkness. The road stretched on, unbroken, endless in its simplicity. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to turn back. I simply let the car glide forward, letting the silence accompany me. Somewhere in the quiet, I acknowledged the weight I had been holding. Not just responsibility, not just hope, but the entire arc of care I had given without expectation. And though the road ahead was unknown, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: release. Not triumph. Not joy. Not sorrow. Just release. Somewhere beyond the dark fields, life waited. And for the first time, I allowed myself to arrive with empty hands. The front door clicked behind me, soft but final. I set my keys down on the hall table and listened to the house settle, the floorboards creaking, the air sighing through open windows. In the living room, light from the setting sun touched the edge of the coffee table, warming the dust motes that danced lazily in the golden rays. I bent down to open a drawer I hadn't looked in for years, the scent of old paper rising to meet me. There they were, slips, envelopes, receipts, quiet, patient witnesses of decades I had spent giving without question. I picked up the first one and felt the weight of every invisible favor I had carried, now resting quietly in my hands. I laid them across the table one by one in careful rows. Grocery receipts, small and crumpled at the edges. Rent envelopes, each stamped with the same name I had signed countless times. Tuition checks tucked in paper sleeves, never mentioned, never thanked beyond polite nods. And then the dress receipt folded neatly, soft against the wood. Each one told a story without words, a record of hours, worry, and effort I had given freely. I traced the lines of ink with my fingertips, feeling the rhythm of a life spent in service to someone else's comfort. It had never occurred to me to question it before. I had assumed that support, care, and quiet generosity were enough. That my presence alone, steady and enduring, meant something beyond payment. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of evening traffic. Shadows stretched across the floor, following the sun as it sank lower. I felt the ache in my chest, subtle but persistent, as I realized how invisible those years had become to the person I had raised. I began to stack the receipts by type, by date, as if arranging them might reveal something I hadn't noticed before. The grocery list sat in one pile, the bills in another, the envelopes with tuition slips in a third. Each stack felt heavier than it should, carrying not numbers or dates, but proof of unreciprocated care. I remembered quiet mornings when I had risen early to make sure he had breakfast before heading out. Afternoons spent arranging bills, ensuring nothing was overdue. Nights when I had double-checked forms, gently nudged him toward responsibilities, and quietly absorbed his complaints. I had been steady, consistent, indispensable, and yet invisible. I held up the wedding dress receipt last, smooth paper, the total figure quietly asserting itself in black ink. I thought of the bride, her polite thanks, her embarrassed smile. Now it felt different. The act had been mine, fully mine. And yet the one person whose presence should have mattered most had been left out completely. The realization settled slowly. Each act of giving had carried a quiet expectation, that love might be recognized, that care might be acknowledged. But here they were, evidence not of gratitude but of utility. I had been needed only as long as I paid. I sank into the chair, the stacks of paper around me like silent witnesses. The pattern emerged clearly for the first time. I had mistaken dependence for love. I had believed that my sacrifices, my attention, my daily vigilance were enough to create connection. But connection, it seemed, was never the goal. I held a tuition envelope in my hand and ran my thumb over the neat handwriting. He had always relied on me, trusted me even, but that trust had been transactional, never emotional. Each receipt, each note, each small act now read like a ledger of necessity, not affection. I felt a strange calm in the midst of it, a quiet shock that left space for clarity. Years of giving spent in the belief that I was building bonds had in truth only built reliance. And that reliance had a shelf life. The wedding, the invitations withheld, the polite acknowledgments of others, all were part of a timeline I had never been told about. I set the envelope down gently and pressed my hands to my face. My eyes traced the stacks again, seeing them not as work or sacrifice but as evidence. Evidence that love, when unasked for, cannot be assumed. That the heart's investment has limits, and sometimes, those limits are revealed in silence. I gathered the receipts slowly, stacking them with care before slipping them back into the drawer. Each one returned to its place, silent but no longer invisible. The room had dimmed into evening, shadows pooling in the corners, the air settling heavy but still. For the first time I recognized my own boundaries, the quiet space where obligation ended and self-respect began. The weight of hope and responsibility I had carried for decades lifted, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a soft acknowledgement. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the quiet rhythm of my home, the floorboards settling, the distant hum of the night, the faint whisper of wind against the windows. And in that calm I asked myself the question I had avoided for too long. How long had I mistaken being needed for being loved? The answer finally felt clear. The sky hadn't yet turned from ink to blue when I stepped out the door, the air sharp against my skin. The envelope sat heavy in my coat pocket, folded neatly, the single receipt inside like a heartbeat pressed to paper. My hands trembled slightly, not with anger, not with grief, but with the quiet weight of intention. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting pools of gold on damp pavement. Every step toward the post office echoed in the silence. I imagined him receiving it, holding it in his hands before sunrise, unaware of the presence that had been steady beside him all these years. And I realized, this act was mine alone. I arrived at the post office just as the first hints of light touched the horizon. The building smelled faintly of paper, wax, and cold metal. Inside, the rows of P.O. boxes stood silent, the counters clean, the clerk moving methodically through early tasks. I didn't want attention. I didn't need it. I only wanted the envelope to leave my hands. I had written the letter hours before, sitting at the kitchen table with the window open to the chill of early spring. My pen had moved slowly, deliberately. Each word measured. Each sentence calm. No bitterness. No accusations. Just acknowledgement. I had tucked the wedding dress receipt inside, a single slip of paper that carried decades of giving, and placed it alongside my quiet words. As I held it now, I felt the gravity of what I was sending. It was not anger. It was not judgment. It was a statement of truth, simple and unadorned. A record of care and the limits I had finally recognized. Outside, the sky lightened, a thin brush of orange on the horizon. I pressed the envelope to my chest for a moment, feeling both weight and relief. I walked to the counter, placing the envelope carefully on the polished wood. The clerk glanced at me briefly, offered a small nod, and returned to sorting parcels. I lingered just a heartbeat longer, imagining his hands opening it. The quiet of the room made my own pulse seem loud. I remembered the years, the early mornings making sure bills were paid, the afternoons arranging groceries and tuition envelopes, the quiet evenings spent listening when no one else had time. I thought of the wedding day, the hidden driveway, the whispered words that confirmed I had never been special enough to be included. I thought of the gentle ache I had carried ever since. And yet, as I pressed the stamp to seal the envelope, a calmness spread through me. This was not revenge. It was closure. A final acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. That my love had limits, my patience had limits, my presence had limits. I handed the envelope to the clerk, watching as it was slid into the slot. A small, unremarkable motion but monumental in my heart. I stepped back, letting the chill air of dawn wash over me, steadying my breath, feeling the morning absorb the tension I had carried. I walked out onto the street, the empty roads stretching before me, slick with dew and early shadows. The envelope was gone now, on its way carrying both weight and quiet dignity. I didn't glance back. There was nothing to see, nothing to undo. For the first time I allowed myself to think not of him, not of the wedding, not of the years of invisible care, but of me. I realized I had been living in service to expectation, hope, and obligation. And that, like the receipt tucked inside that envelope, some truths must be acknowledged to move forward. I imagined him opening it, alone, perhaps still sleepy, the morning chill in his home. His fingers would unfold the paper. He would see the receipt. He might remember the moments behind it, or he might not. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the acknowledgement existed. My care, my boundaries, my voice, finally in their place. A single bird called from a nearby tree, breaking the stillness. I let the sound linger in the quiet of my chest. I didn't hope for gratitude. I didn't hope for apology. I simply allowed the knowledge to settle. I had spoken my truth softly, fully, without demand. The first true light of morning stretched across the rooftops, pale and gentle. I felt it on my face as I stepped into the car, the engine humming beneath me like a steady heartbeat. The envelope was gone. My message had left me. I breathed slowly, letting the cool air settle the tension in my shoulders. There was nothing left to weigh me down. For the first time in years, the road ahead felt open, quiet, and mine. Somewhere miles away, he would hold a small slip of paper with numbers and dates that had meant more than he ever knew. And somewhere in the soft hush of dawn, I understood that closure could arrive quietly, without drama, without noise, simply in the act of letting go. I turned the key and the car moved forward into the morning, carrying me at last along with it. The morning sun poured through the windows, soft and unassuming, brushing the edges of furniture I had once arranged for someone else. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, and the floorboards creaked gently under my bare feet. I moved slowly, almost reverently, touching shelves, tables, and counters as though testing whether the house remembered who I was. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like space, breathable, open, expectant. I realized the rooms had been waiting for me to notice them, to reclaim them from the weight of invisible obligations. The house exhaled quietly as I crossed the living room, each step a subtle reclamation of life that had quietly slipped away. I began with the shelves that had once held gifts I bought for their home. Small picture frames, delicate vases, a set of teacups I'd hoped would be meaningful. Each item I touched carried a memory, gentle but persistent. For years I had moved them carefully, ensuring they were seen, used, or at least acknowledged. Now I sorted them with intent, separating memory from expectation. Some items I boxed up to donate, others I stored or set aside, as if telling the house quietly that it belonged to me now. The air seemed lighter as I worked, the dust motes catching sunlight in new ways, the rooms stretching like waking creatures. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through slightly open windows, and it felt like applause of a sort, not for me but for the recognition of space regained. I paused at the dining table, running my fingers across the smooth surface. Once, it had been crowded with receipts, plans, and obligations for someone else's life. Now it stood empty, clean, waiting for moments that belonged solely to me. I realized that care does not have to be endless. Love does not demand self-erasure. The house seemed to nod in agreement, its quiet corners forgiving and patient. I moved to the guest bedroom, the one I had kept tidy in case they visited. The closet was full of folded blankets, extra linens, items I had bought for comfort, all intended to ease the lives of people who had long since crossed another threshold without me. I lifted them carefully, placing them in bags, each fold a gentle farewell. The hallway reflected my own reflection in the mirror at the end, the lines of my face softened by morning light. I paused there, noticing the subtle weight lifted from my shoulders, the quiet rhythm of breathing that no longer included worry for others' choices. The house hummed beneath me, floors stretching, ceilings lightening, as if finally allowed to speak its own quiet truth. I opened drawers that had been closed for years, removing clutter accumulated in the service of expectation. Letters, old receipts, small tokens of giving, they all had their place but no longer dictated my sense of worth. I realized that freedom, like light, could slip through spaces unnoticed until you moved aside to let it in. Standing by the window, I watched the yard bathed in soft sunlight. The grass swayed gently, shadows long and thin. I let the quiet wrap around me, a warmth I had forgotten existed. The house my home was breathing again. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the sofa, letting the warmth seep into my palms. For the first time, I didn't imagine someone else sitting across from me. There was no expectation, no careful choreography of life meant to please. The rooms belonged to me. The quiet belonged to me. I wandered from room to room, noticing details I had overlooked. The way the sunlight hit the windowsill at noon, the subtle unevenness of the floorboards, the sound of wind in the trees outside. The house had been waiting patiently for me to reclaim it. I understood now that care can be generous without being endless. Support can be loving without requiring invisibility. I opened the curtains fully, letting the morning flood the rooms. Shadows receded, the air warmed. I placed a small vase on the kitchen table, filled it with fresh flowers from the garden, and smiled at their unspoken greeting. The house responded with a quiet approval, the walls no longer heavy with obligations past. I thought of the envelope, the letter, the receipts, all released, sent, acknowledged. And I felt something delicate settle in my chest, a mixture of grief, relief, and possibility. I had mourned, I had acted, and now I could inhabit the space again, fully and honestly. I stood at the window watching light stretch across the yard. The shadows of trees softened, the grass waved gently, and the air smelled faintly of earth and sun. For years, heartbreak had lived here quietly, in corners and on shelves, in memories folded into objects I had carried for others. Now it felt like the house exhaled and I inhaled with it. Freedom was small, quiet, unassuming, but it was present and it was mine. I leaned against the frame, letting the warmth of sunlight brush my face. Could freedom truly arrive in the same space where heartbreak once lived? I didn't need to answer. The house had already begun to tell me. It whispered of possibility, of quiet reclamation, of life moving forward. And I listened. The phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter, a small vibration against the wood. I picked it up, expecting nothing, yet somehow anticipating, though what I couldn't have said. The screen showed a message, short and precise, a request for more help. I read it once, then again. No anger rose. No frustration. Only clarity, like sunlight breaking through a window left closed for too long. I set the phone down gently, letting its quiet hum fade into the stillness of the evening. And in that stillness I felt a strange, expansive freedom, something I had never allowed myself to feel before. The kitchen smelled faintly of tea and the lingering warmth of the day. Outside, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving shadows that pooled softly across the counters and floors. I sank into a chair, letting my hands rest on the table, palms down, steadying my breath. For years, I had moved through life as if every choice, every act of care, had to be justified by someone else's acknowledgement. I had believed that love could be earned through patience, through sacrifice, through constant vigilance. But the message on the screen changed nothing, because I had already changed. I thought of the envelopes, the receipts, the years spent quietly giving. I thought of the wedding, the absence, the silence that followed. I thought of the house I had reclaimed, the freedom in the morning light, and the simple acts of sorting, discarding, letting go. Each memory built a mosaic of clarity. I was not needed to exist. My presence was not a transaction. I was simply myself. The stillness of the room pressed against me like a soft question. Who would I become if I stopped moving to meet the expectations of someone who never offered me a place? I stood and walked to the window, watching the yard settle into twilight. Trees swayed gently, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and evening coolness. I let the quiet envelope my thoughts, noticing how long it had been since I had simply existed without a ledger attached to my name. I thought of the message again, short and precise. A request for help. Nothing more. No apology. No acknowledgement of past years. No recognition of my sacrifices. And I realized I didn't need it. I didn't need permission to stop, to set boundaries, to reclaim my own rhythm. I pressed my hands to the glass, feeling the coolness against my skin. I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. Even the house seemed to breathe with me, echoing the quiet certainty I felt. I imagined him reading the message, expecting the automatic compliance I had once offered. But the answer had been decided long before I even saw the text. I let my fingers trace the edge of the window frame. The light in the yard softened, shadows melting into the deep blue of evening. For the first time I felt what it truly meant to choose myself. Not in reaction, not in defiance, but as an affirmation. I moved back to the table, setting the phone aside. I didn't need to respond. The act of reading, acknowledging, and then releasing was enough. For the first time my choice was not for someone else. It was for me. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, letting the weight of years settle and then lift. The pattern I had followed, years of giving, waiting, hoping, was finally broken. I felt my chest expand in a way I hadn't realized was possible. Not lightness exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when you stop carrying the expectations of others like a second skin. I thought of all the mornings, evenings, and nights I had spent trying to earn a place that had never been offered. And for the first time I allowed myself to imagine a life unshaped by that need. What would it feel like to make decisions for me alone? To act without apology or explanation. To rest without calculation or anticipation. The air in the kitchen was cool and soft. The house had settled into quiet rhythm, familiar yet newly mine. I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the calm fill every corner of me. The evening deepened, shadows pooling across the floor like liquid ink. I watched the faint glimmer of light on the horizon, where night met day's remnants. For the first time I felt the horizon inside me as well. A stretch of possibility, unclaimed and waiting. I rose and walked to the window, letting my hands rest lightly on the frame. The message sat quietly on the counter, unresponded to, harmless in its persistence. I realized that life could be soft, deliberate, and mine without anyone's permission. I breathed deeply, feeling the subtle thrill of freedom in the small movements of my body, the still air of the house, the quiet unfolding of evening. And I asked myself, not in doubt but in wonder, who might I become now that the truth has finally spoken? For the first time in decades I didn't need an answer. I simply began to imagine it.